A police officer who had chosen a quiet life in a remote cabin deep in the snowy woods thought his days of protecting others were long behind him, until one freezing night, a homeless girl in a tattered red coat appeared at his door, cradling a badly injured canine dog in her arms. She didn't tell him her name. She didn't explain why she had braved the storm with the animal barely clinging to life. But her trembling voice, saying, "Please don't let him die," told him there was something dark she was running from. What happened next would change all their lives. Please don't leave this video. Keep listening to discover how hope and kindness can still be found in this world. And remember to like and support our channel. Amen. The storm had swallowed Elk Ridge whole. Snow fell in heavy, wind-driven curtains, swirling between the narrow streets and the dark timberline that rimmed the small Montana town. It was the kind of cold that crept into bone and thought alike, leaving the world brittle and still. In the hills, 2 miles beyond the last streetlight, stood a weather-worn cabin, its cedar siding half buried under drifts, the chimney breathing out ribbons of smoke that vanished into the white. Inside, Officer Jonah Hale sat at a scarred oak table, his back to the wood stove that hissed and popped with resin. Jonah was 35, broad-shouldered from years in uniform, his hair a dark chestnut clipped short for practicality, and his eyes, gray-blue like sleet, held a perpetual watchfulness. He wore the county police winter coat even at home, an old habit born from too many nights where a knock could drag him into the cold with no warning. Since the botched raid 5 years ago that had cost him his canine partner, his manner had quieted, the easy humor stripped down to a calm, methodical reserve. He still carried the badge, but now he worked alone whenever possible, answering only the calls he had to, as if minimizing his own opportunity to fail anyone else. The knock came brittle and sharp, 3 raps nearly lost in the howl of the wind. Jonah froze, hand hovering above his mug of coffee. Few came this far in weather like this, and no one without a reason. He pushed away from the table, boots creaking against the wood floor, and crossed to the door. When he opened it, the porch light carved a small island of gold into the storm. Standing in that light was a girl, maybe 13, her cheeks raw and wind-burned, hair a messy ash blonde that clung in frozen strands to her flushed face. Her eyes, wide, glacial blue, were bright with fear and something harder beneath, the kind of resolve children shouldn't have to wear. She wore a tattered red winter dress or coat, the hem crusted with snow, sleeves frayed and elbows torn, revealing pale skin mottled with cold. In her arms, she cradled a large German shepherd, his sable black and tan coat matted with ice and snow. His head lolled against her shoulder, eyes half closed, the steady rise and fall of his chest marred by a tremor of pain. A crude red and white bandage wrapped his right foreleg, already seeping fresh blood into the cloth. "Please," she said, her voice raw, the wind stealing half the word. "He's dying." Jonah stepped forward instantly, his training and the old ache in his chest flaring as one. "Inside. Now!" He held the door wide, ushering her in with a hand at her back. The cabin's heat hit them in a wave, but the girl didn't flinch. She only clutched the dog tighter, as if afraid the warmth might take him from her. Jonah guided them toward the couch by the wood stove and knelt to help her lower the animal onto an old wool blanket. "What's his name?" "Atlas," she said. Jonah's gaze swept the dog quickly. Male, around 7 years old, muscular but gaunt from neglect, amber eyes dulled but still alert under the haze of pain. The injury to the leg was deep. The pulse in the paw was thready. Jonah felt the familiar stab of memory. Another dog, another night, blood on snow, and pushed it down. "I need to get him to the clinic," he said, already rising. "No." The word cracked sharp in the warm air. She shook her head fiercely. "No hospitals, no vet. They'll find us." Jonah studied her slight frame, posture tense but ready to bolt, eyes scanning the windows even now. "Who's they?" She hesitated, then said, "The men who hurt him. They took him from the county canine kennel, said he was retired, but they made him guard a place on the edge of town, a repo yard. They keep cars and trucks there, but it's not about that. At night, it's where they do things, illegal things." She glanced down at Atlas, who whimpered softly. "Last night, he wouldn't bite a man they told him to. They kicked him. I tried to stop them. They came after me. I ran." Jonah crouched beside her again, hearing the fear under the steel in her voice. "What's your name?" "Ren." she said after a moment. No last name. Jonah didn't press. He could feel the storm tightening outside and something else trouble pressing closer. He lifted Atlas gently, carrying him to the fireside rug. The dog's breath hitched, but he didn't protest, leaning his weight into Jonah's arms as if sensing safety for the first time in hours. Jonah fetched a bowl of warm water and a clean towel, pressing it lightly against the wound to slow the bleeding. Wren sat nearby, hands clenched in her lap, eyes tracking every movement. "You work alone out here?" she asked suddenly. Jonah gave a small shrug. "Mostly." He didn't mention the silence with his sister May, the only family he had left in town. May was a paramedic, sharp-witted and quick with her hands, her compact frame always in motion, but she hadn't spoken to him in 3 years, not since the raid, when Jonah had chosen to push forward on faulty intel and May's ambulance had arrived too late to save his canine partner. Now she treated him like another patient she didn't have time for. Wren said nothing more, and Jonah didn't push her. He was already thinking of May, of the skills she could bring to Atlas's care. But calling her would mean reopening old wounds, and tonight, with the wind battering the cabin walls, he wasn't sure either of them was ready for that. Instead, he said, "That yard you mentioned on the edge of town, who runs it?" Wren's gaze flicked to the firelight. "A man named Clint Mercer, my stepfather." She spat the word like a bitter seed. "He works for a company called Northline Holdings. They take retired canines and rent them out to people who want protection they can't get legally, sometimes to scare people. Sometimes worse." Jonah felt his jaw tighten. Northline was the same name circling the council meetings lately, tied to a push to privatize the county's canine unit. The developer's plan had split the town. Half saw it as a way to save money, half as a threat to public safety. Jonah had stayed out of it, telling himself it wasn't his fight. But if what Wren was saying was true, maybe it was exactly his fight. He kept working on Atlas's bandage, replacing the sodden cloth with a clean wrap, then adding a splint from a cut length of kindling. "This will hold for now," he said quietly. Wren's shoulders eased a fraction, but her eyes stayed sharp. "We can't stay here long," she murmured. Jonah nodded. He knew the type of men she was talking about. They wouldn't care about the snow or the cold, only about tying up loose ends. He glanced toward the dark window where the wind rattled the glass. Out there, somewhere beyond the swirl of snow, was a town still asleep, a council still debating what to do with its dogs, and a sister who didn't know he was about to step into the middle of it again. For now, though, he had 2 living souls in his care, and a storm holding the world at bay. That would have to be enough until it wasn't. The wind had shifted by morning, no longer screaming against the cabin walls, but whistling low through the gaps in the eaves, like a warning that refused to fade. The fire in the stove had burned down to a steady red glow, the air inside thick with the scent of wood smoke and wet fur. Wren sat cross-legged on the couch, clutching a chipped mug of cocoa Jonah had made from the last tin in his pantry. Atlas lay stretched across the rug, his breathing steadier now but still shallow. The crude bandage on his leg darkened with seeped blood. Jonah was leaning against the counter, debating with himself, when the sound of a vehicle crunching over frozen gravel reached them. He crossed to the window in 2 long strides and peered out. A white county EMS truck rolled to a stop beside his patrol vehicle, the back door flung open before the engine even shut down. May Hale climbed out, pulling her wool hat lower over her cropped dark blonde hair. She was 32, small and wiry, built like someone who could slip through tight spaces and carry a full trauma kit without slowing down. Her hazel eyes had the same steel as Jonah's, but sharper at the edges, the kind of gaze that measured a person before deciding whether they were worth her time. Years in emergency response had left her voice brisk, her manner efficient, but the failed raid that had taken Jonah's canine partner had drawn an unspoken line between them. They hadn't spoken outside of duty calls since. Today, she didn't waste breath on greetings. She stepped inside, dropping her kit beside Atlas and kneeling with practiced ease. "Pulse?" she asked without looking up. "Weak, but holding," Jonah replied. "You called me for a dog," she said flatly, but her hands were already working scissors cutting away the blood-clogged bandage, fingers probing gently along the swollen limb. 7-year-old German Shepherd, she murmured, more to herself now. "Good muscle tone before the injury, trauma's recent." She glanced up at Wren. "You the handler?" Wren shook her head, eyes wary. "No, he's my friend." May didn't push. She'd seen enough frightened kids to know when to keep her questions shallow. Jonah used May's focus as cover to coax more of Wren's story. The girl's voice was hesitant at first, then steadier as if the telling itself hardened her resolve. She had been living in the decommissioned rail depot for months, ever since her mother's passing and Clint Mercer's indifference had pushed her out. Clint, her stepfather, was a thick-set man in his 40s with a face weathered from years outdoors, but a temper that could snap like a dry branch. He worked security for Northline Holdings, a shell company with a clean public face and dirt under every fingernail. At night, they rented out retired canines for private jobs with no questions asked. Atlas, once a county canine, had been taken into that rotation. When he refused to follow an order to attack a man, they beat him. Wren intervened, and Clint decided both she and the dog were liabilities. May finished flushing the wound and wrapping it in sterile gauze, layering a soft splint over the limb. This will hold for now, but he needs rest. Keep him warm, keep him hydrated. No running, no stairs. She rose, brushing off her knees, and gave Jonah a look that was both a challenge and a question. So what's the plan? Because if you called me out here, you're already in deeper than you should be. Jonah didn't answer her directly. Instead, he retrieved his handheld scanner from a desk drawer and crouched beside Atlas, passing the reader over the dog's shoulder. The microchip number blinked on the small screen, along with the owner's registry. Jonah's jaw tightened. "Reassigned last week," he said. "Signature's not county issue." May peered over his shoulder. "That's a forgery. Sloppy one, too." Wren slipped a hand into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a folded, grease-stained page. "I took this from Clint's desk, before I ran." She flattened it on the table. The ledger was filled with columns, dates, addresses, amounts in cash, and short notes. Most of the entries were scrawled in a rough hand, but one stood out. A name written with deliberate, looping precision, P. Laird. Jonah's stomach sank. Peter Laird was the same councilman who had been spearheading the push to privatize the K-9 unit, selling it as a budget fix for the county. Laird was polished in public, tall, silver-haired, with a politician's smile, but Jonah had heard whispers about his ties to developers and out-of-state investors. If his name was in Clint's ledger alongside cash transactions for protection nights, it meant the rot was deeper than anyone wanted to admit. Wren looked between them, reading the shift in their faces. "If you tell the police, he'll know by morning," she said. "Clint will know. They'll move the dogs, hide the money, say it's all made up. You won't have proof." Jonah knew she was right. Filing this through official channels would be like shouting a warning before an arrest. The people who needed to be caught would vanish into the snow. He tapped the ledger page with one finger. "Then we don't file it. Not yet." May crossed her arms. "You planning to play detective again? You remember how that went last time." The weight of her words pressed the air between them. Jonah didn't flinch. "Last time I lost a partner. I'm not making the same mistakes." May's gaze lingered on him, unreadable. Then she picked up her kit. "You'd better not." She looked at Wren. "He's stubborn. That can be good or bad. Decide which it is before you trust him too much." As May left, the cold swept briefly into the cabin, carrying with it the distant sound of chains clinking on the tires of her EMS truck. Wren traced the edge of the ledger page with one fingertip. "So what do we do now?" Jonah glanced at Atlas, who had drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep by the fire. "We keep him safe. We find out who else is in that book, and we make sure when we move we hit hard enough they can't get back up." The wind rose again, rattling the windows like a quiet applause or a warning. It was hard to tell which. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft enough to cover tracks but heavy enough to keep the roads empty, at least for now. In Elk Ridge, the council would be gathering soon to debate the K-9 privatization proposal, never knowing their champion's name sat in a grease-stained ledger in a cabin 2 miles from town. For Jonah, the path was narrowing. Every step forward meant stepping back into the kind of fight he'd sworn to avoid. But for Wren, it was simple. Her goal hadn't changed. Atlas was alive, and she would do whatever it took to keep it that way. The day wore on with the deceptive calm. The snow had stopped its heavy fall and instead turned to a fine, icy sleet that hissed against the cabin's windows and roof, coating the world in a thin, glassy sheen. It was the kind of weather that carried sound further than it should boots on crusted snow. A car door shutting, the low murmur of voices. Wren was on the couch with Atlas's head in her lap, running her small fingers gently over his ears. Jonah sat by the stove, eyes on the window though his body seemed still. May was washing out the few bloodied towels in a steel basin, sleeves rolled up, jaw tight. She didn't like staying still. In her world, stillness meant the next call would be worse. Then headlights appeared through the sleet, cutting narrow cones of light across the tree line. They moved slow, deliberate, the vehicle's engine a low growl against the hush of the woods. The lights dimmed and Jonah could just make out the silhouette of a black pickup idling down the road. It stopped. Two men stepped out, both wearing matte black jackets and gloves. They didn't carry themselves like hunters or hikers. They moved with the unhurried confidence of people who believed they had the upper hand. One was lean and angular, with a hawk-like face and deep-set eyes shadowed under a black beanie. The other was heavier, thick-necked, with a shaved head that gleamed under the sleet, a jagged scar cutting down from his ear to the side of his jaw. Jonah didn't know their names, but he didn't have to. They were the kind of men Clint Mercer would send when subtlety had failed. May caught his gaze from across the room. "We can't fight a storm and a cover-up," she said, her voice low but edged. Jonah didn't argue. He glanced at Wren. "We have to move now." Atlas stirred weakly as Jonah knelt beside him. "We'll make this easier for him," Jonah said, pulling a small sedative ampule from May's kit. May hesitated, but her training won out. She drew the dose and passed it over. Within moments, Atlas's breathing deepened into a steady rhythm, his body limp but safe to move. Jonah went to the back wall and pulled out a toboggan sled, the old wooden kind with metal runners stored there for hauling firewood or feed in winter. They laid a thick quilt over it, then positioned Atlas gently on top, wrapping him in layers until he looked more like a bundle of blankets than a living creature. Wren clutched his head for a moment, whispering something only he could hear. Jonah stepped into his boots and shrugged into his heavy coat. "We're going through the timber line," he said. "No roads." May grabbed her own coat, slinging her medical bag over one shoulder. Wren followed, wearing Jonah's spare scarf wound twice around her neck. They slipped out the back door into the sleet, the cold biting instantly at exposed skin. The world had that muted, muffled quality of a winter dusk, colors drained to shades of gray and blue. The toboggan's runners hissed quietly over the crusted snow as Jonah pulled, keeping his pace steady to avoid jostling Atlas. The woods closed around them, tall spruce and pine bowing under the weight of ice. Halfway down the first slope, Jonah stopped and crouched beside the sled. From his coat pocket, he pulled the grease-stained ledger page and a small prepaid phone. He snapped a photo of Atlas's altered microchip record, then rolled both into a piece of wax paper and slid them into an old steel thermos. It was dented and scratched, but in farm towns like this, a thermos was the most invisible safe you could carry. Nobody looked twice at one. He wedged it into the sled's cargo bag under the blankets. May moved up beside him. Her breath fogged in the air as she adjusted her gloves. "You know I blamed you for that raid," she said without looking at him. Jonah kept his hands on the sled's rope, waiting. "You chose the mission over the dog. I had to call time of death, Jonah. I thought if you'd just pulled back, he might have made it." Jonah's jaw tightened. The memory was as raw as ever night vision goggles, the pop of gunfire, his partner's last yelp cutting through the chaos. "And tonight?" he asked. May glanced at Atlas, bundled and still. "Tonight you're choosing the dog first. Maybe that's why I came when you called." They continued down through the timber line, following a path Jonah knew would bring them to the old mill bridge, a weathered wooden span over the frozen creek, long closed to vehicles but still sturdy enough for foot traffic. The sleet had turned the planks slick, and the railings were rimed with frost. Below, the creek was a dark ribbon under the ice, the current audible as a low rush. They were halfway across when Jonah paused again, scanning the woods behind them. The black pickup was nowhere in sight, but the sound of branches snapping carried faintly through the trees. He didn't like it. They weren't far ahead of whoever was following. On the far side of the bridge stood an old maintenance shed, roof sagging under the snow. Jonah led them around it, heading toward the narrow trail that would take them into deeper cover. Every step further from the cabin felt like a gamble trading familiar ground for the hope of invisibility. As they disappeared into the tree line, the wind shifted again, carrying with it the low hum of an engine starting up somewhere beyond the bridge. Jonah didn't look back. For now, the priority was distance, cover, and keeping the thermos and what it held safe. The frozen planks of Mill Bridge groaned under Jonah's boots as he pulled the toboggan across, each step a calculated push against the glassy sheen of sleet and ice. The cold bit deeper here, where the wind had no trees to blunt its teeth. The creek below was a dull ribbon under fractured ice, the rush of unseen water adding a low, constant warning to the air. Wren followed close behind, her arms wrapped tight around herself, scarf drawn high over her face, eyes fixed on the bundled shape of Atlas in the sled. May walked backward at the rear, scanning the trail they had come from, her posture tense. The faint crunch of snow behind them had been growing louder for the past 2 minutes. From the tree line at the bridge's far end, 3 figures emerged. The first was Clint Mercer, broader than Jonah remembered from the last time they had crossed paths, but still carrying that hunched, forward-leaning swagger that made him look like he was always moving toward a fight. His face was raw from the wind, the skin along his cheekbones chapped to a dark red, and there was something else in his eyes, guilt, buried under a layer of defiance. Behind him came the 2 men Jonah had glimpsed outside the cabin, the lean one with the hawk-like features, and the heavy one with the scar carved from ear to jaw. They fanned out slightly, blocking the exit. Clint's voice carried over the wind, low and gravelly. "Give me the girl, Jonah. And the mutt. No one has to get hurt." Wren's breath puffed visibly in the air. She stepped forward before Jonah could stop her, her voice trembling but deliberate. "He's not your dog." Atlas stirred at the sound of her voice, shifting under the blankets. With a strained effort, he tried to rise, the muscles in his neck taut, but the bandaged leg buckled immediately and he sank back down, a low whine escaping his throat. Jonah's pulse thudded in his ears. The bridge's slick surface left no room for drawn-out standoffs. Any sudden movement could send someone over the side. He took a slow breath, unclipped his service pistol from its holster, and lowered it deliberately onto the ice. With a push of his boot, he slid it forward, the black metal skittering toward Clint. "You want them? You come get them," Jonah said, his tone even, but his stance ready. The scarred man moved first, lunging to grab Wren's arm. She twisted, teeth flashing in the dim light, and bit down hard on the fleshy base of his thumb. He swore and jerked back, shaking his hand, the shock of it almost comical in the middle of the frozen tension. That was all the opening May needed. She broke from the rear, boots slamming against the planks, and yanked down the rusted iron lever mounted to the bridge's side. The mechanism groaned in protest, but then the old snow gate above them shuddered loose, releasing a thick sheet of drift that dropped like a curtain between the 2 groups. Powder and ice exploded across the bridge, blinding and staggering Clint's men. Jonah charged through the haze of snow and slammed into Clint with his shoulder, driving him back against the railing. The wood creaked ominously under their combined weight. Clint swung a wild punch, catching Jonah along the jaw, but Jonah answered with a sharp shove that bent Clint nearly over the edge. Out of the corner of his eye, Jonah saw Atlas forcing himself upright despite the splint, teeth bared. In a flash of the training buried deep in his bones, the German shepherd lunged forward and latched onto Clint's sleeve, his jaws locking with a growl that cut through the howl of the wind. The hawk-faced man was still trying to clear snow from his eyes when the rising wail of sirens began to echo through the frozen air. Red and blue lights bloomed at the far bank, refracting off the ice and sleet. Deputy Lila Rourke's cruiser slid to a controlled stop just beyond the bridge. Lila was tall, in her early 40s, with a wiry build and sharp fox-brown eyes that missed nothing. Even through the sleet, Jonah could see her steady posture as she stepped out, one hand resting near her holstered weapon, the other already holding a radio to her mouth. The sudden arrival of authority shifted the tension like a knife twisting in a knot. The scarred man backed toward the tree line, muttering under his breath. The hawk-faced one glanced at Clint, then at the cruiser, clearly weighing his chances. Clint, pinned between Jonah and Atlas's grip, finally released a ragged breath. "This isn't over," he spat, though the words carried less threat now and more retreat. Jonah didn't loosen his stance until Lila stepped onto the bridge, her boots steady despite the slick surface. "Looks like I showed up just in time," she said, her gaze flicking over Jonah, May, Wren, and finally Atlas, still holding his grip like a soldier refusing to stand down. The snow curtain from the gate was already settling, the bridge coated in a fresh layer of powder that muffled the crunch of boots. The creek below gurgled on, oblivious to the clash above. Jonah kept one hand on the sled's rope, the other ready, as Lila's backup units began to arrive at the far bank. Tonight had reached its turning point. There would be no going back to quiet isolation after this. But for the moment, the dog was alive. The girl was safe. And the sound of sirens was a promise that they weren't standing alone on the ice anymore. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and wet fur, a mingling that clung to the linoleum floors and metal counters. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh glow flattening every shadow, making the place feel too bright for the exhaustion that clung to Jonah's bones. Atlas lay on the operating table in the small surgical suite, his sable coat shaved around the splinted leg, fresh sutures hidden under crisp white bandages. The veterinarian, Dr. Helen Price, a tall, silver-haired woman in her early 60s with long, deliberate hands and a calm, low voice, was adjusting the IV drip. Helen had the posture of someone who'd spent decades bending over animals and the expression of someone who measured her words before speaking. She'd been the town's vet since before Jonah had joined the force, and though she rarely dealt with working canines, her skill was as steady as her demeanor. "Tendon torn, artery nicked," she said, glancing at the chart. "But the heart? The heart is unstoppable. He'll make it." Her eyes flicked to Wren, who stood beside the table like a sentry, one small hand resting on Atlas's shoulder. "He'll need weeks of rest, someone committed to the follow-through." Jonah answered before Wren could. "He's got that." May, sitting in a corner chair with her paramedic jacket slung over her knees, finally let her shoulders drop. She'd been silent since they left the bridge, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving only a focused weariness. She caught Jonah's eye and gave the smallest nod acknowledgement without words. The relief was short-lived. The double doors banged open, letting in a gust of night air and the scent of sleet. Councilman Peter Laird entered, flanked by a man in a tailored navy suit. Laird was in his late 50s, tall, with silver hair combed back like a campaign poster and a smile so polished it felt like glass. But tonight there was no smile, only the sharp lines of someone who'd skipped sleep to get ahead of a problem. The lawyer, younger, sandy-haired and soft-handed, carried a leather folio tucked under his arm. "Officer Hale," Laird said, voice ringing in the small space as if he were speaking from a podium. "I'm here under court order to take custody of this animal. He's municipal property." The lawyer slid the folio open, producing papers stamped with the county seal. Wren stiffened, stepping closer to Atlas. "You can't." Jonah raised a hand, not to silence her but to steady the moment. Lila Rourke emerged from the hallway behind them, still in her deputy's winter gear, boots dripping melted sleet on the tile. Her fox-brown eyes were unreadable as she stepped forward, body angled between Laird and the table. "Funny thing about municipal property," she said, unclipping her body cam from her coat. "Sometimes it tells a story you don't want a judge to hear." She tapped the small screen. The room filled with the tinny playback of Clint Mercer's voice from the bridge, his growl carrying clear, "Give me the girl and the mutt. No one has to get hurt." There was enough in those few seconds, the implied threat, the admission of control over Atlas to punch a hole clean through the court order's premise. Laird's jaw twitched, but the lawyer pressed on. "That doesn't change municipal ownership." Jonah cut him off by pulling the dented thermos from his coat and setting it heavily on the counter. He unscrewed the lid, withdrew the wax-wrapped contents, and slid them across the stainless steel surface to Helen, who stared for a moment before peeling them open. Ledger page, phone photo of the altered microchip record, names, dates, cash totals, and P. Laird in neat looping letters. Lila was already dialing. "Judge Hanlon," she said into the phone when the line picked up. The voice on the other end was muffled, gruff with sleep. Lila outlined the situation in clipped detail. The bridge encounter, the forged registry, the ledger evidence. Jonah leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on Laird's face as the judge's voice grew sharper on the other end of the call. By the time Lila hung up, the lawyer's confident posture had deflated. "Orders void," she said simply. "Judge Hanlon wants all evidence forwarded to a state investigator. That'll be happening before sunrise." Laird's gaze slid from Jonah to Wren to Atlas, then back to Jonah. "You're making enemies you can't afford, officer." Jonah didn't blink. "I'll live with that." The councilman and his lawyer turned and left without another word, the door swinging shut behind them with a soft thud. For a long moment, the only sound was the steady beep of the heart monitor and the hum of the fluorescent lights. May stood, crossing the space between them. She put a hand on Jonah's shoulder, her grip firm. "You didn't lose another one," she said quietly. It was more than praise. It was a release from years of unspoken blame. Jonah allowed himself the smallest exhale, the first hint of belief settling into his chest. Atlas shifted slightly under the blanket, a low, contented rumble in his throat as if he too could feel the weight lifting from the room. By the second week of March, the last crusts of snow were retreating from the meadows around Elk Ridge, leaving the ground soft and patched with early shoots of green. The air held a damp sweetness that hinted at spring, though the peaks still wore their white crowns. In town, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, their cameras aimed not at Jonah or May, but at Peter Laird, who walked stiffly between two state marshals. His once perfect hair looked flat in the morning drizzle, and the tightness in his jaw suggested the indictment had landed hard. Beside him, Clint Mercer kept his head down, his thick shoulders hunched inward. He had cut a deal, turning state's witness in exchange for a lighter sentence. The man who had once barked orders in the repo yard now shuffled in silence, the glint of handcuffs just visible under his jacket sleeves. The fallout spread quickly. Within days, Northline Holdings withdrew its development proposal. The county commissioners voted 5-0 to dissolve the private contract and rebuild the K-9 unit as a public trust, complete with citizen oversight, transparent budgeting, and a guaranteed retirement program for every service dog. In the sheriff's office, a corkboard map of the county now bore fresh red pins for each K-9 foster home, a visual promise that the animals wouldn't be discarded once their working years ended. For Wren, the legal storm wasn't over. One morning, Jonah and May walked with her into the family court building, a squat brick structure whose narrow hallways smelled faintly of paper and coffee. The hearing room was modest, cream-painted walls, a single flag behind the bench, and wooden pew benches for spectators. Judge Karen Doyle, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked brown hair pulled into a no-nonsense twist, presided with a calm, even voice. She was known in the county for her fair but unyielding manner, having grown up in foster care herself before putting herself through law school. Her eyes, a deep brown, had a way of softening when children spoke, but they could turn to polished stone in an instant when she sensed deceit. Wren sat between Jonah and May, hands clasped in her lap. Atlas wasn't allowed in the room until testimony was done, but the thought of him waiting in the hallway seemed to steady her. May took the stand first. Dressed in her cleanest paramedic uniform, she spoke clearly about the night she arrived at Jonah's cabin, about Wren's refusal to leave Atlas despite the danger, and the resourcefulness she showed in protecting the ledger page. "She's not just a child who survived something," May said, her voice warming. "She's a child who acted when most adults wouldn't." Jonah followed, his voice low but steady as he submitted a formal petition for temporary foster guardianship. He kept his words simple, focusing on Wren's safety, her bond with Atlas, and the stability he could offer. The petition also included May as a medical sponsor, ensuring Wren's healthcare and schooling would be handled without delay. Jonah glanced at Wren once during his statement. She met his gaze and gave a small nod. When it was Wren's turn, she stood on her own. Her tattered red coat had been replaced with a simple denim jacket May had found for her, and her hair, though still wind-tousled, had been combed that morning. She spoke in short sentences about the depot she'd been living in, the night she took Atlas, and what she wanted now. "I just want to stay where Atlas is," she said, her voice almost breaking on the word stay. Judge Doyle listened without interruption. She looked over the petition, the testimonies, and the reports from the county investigator assigned after the bridge incident. Then she leaned forward slightly, her tone softening. "I'm granting temporary guardianship to Officer Jonah Hale with Ms. May Hale as medical sponsor. This arrangement will remain until a permanent review in 6 months." The door at the back opened, and Atlas padded in on 3 good legs, the 4th still bandaged but no longer splinted. His tail swept the air like a broom, and his amber eyes locked on Wren. She dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around his neck, and he pressed his head against her chest with a low huff of contentment. That evening, the porch light of Jonah's cabin glowed against the darkening woods. The wind was gentle now, carrying the scent of thawed earth and pine sap. A new wooden plaque hung beside the door. The lettering burned deep and dark. Hale and Atlas K-9 Retirement and Rescue. May had insisted on the rescue part. Jonah hadn't argued. In the soft pool of light from the porch lamp, Wren crouched near the steps with a small pine sapling Jonah had found at the edge of the timber line. She pressed the soil around its base, her fingers damp and chilled from the evening air. When she was done, she sat back on her heels, looking up at Jonah. For the dogs who need to find the porch, she said. Jonah felt something settle in him then, something that had been loose and shifting since the night of the raid years ago. The house behind him wasn't just shelter anymore. It was a place to return to. Inside, Atlas circled his bed twice before lying down, his head facing the door. The light on the porch stayed on, cutting a warm square into the night, and for the first time in a long while, Jonah didn't mind who might find their way to it. Sometimes the greatest rescues in life are not just about saving someone else, but about allowing yourself to be saved in return. Jonah thought he was protecting Ren and Atlas, yet they brought him back to a place of hope and purpose. Ren fought for her dog but found a family in the process. Atlas, once discarded, became the heartbeat of a home that would welcome others like him. In our everyday lives, we may pass by people or animals who are carrying invisible battles. A small act of kindness, a choice to stand with them, can change not just their story, but yours too. If this story touched your heart, please share it so others can feel the warmth of its message. Comment below with your thoughts and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of courage and compassion. May God bless everyone who watches this. If you believe in the power of hope, type Amen in the comments.